My father was not quite as active, except for his for later years. Later in I guess after he was 60, in that age, 55 or 60, he became treasurer, and then he stayed in the church. And so, and I was glad, because when I felt I was called a preacher, I had to tell him about it. I was glad he was in the church so that he could be warmly receptive to me, because he looked forward to my being a lawyer and a businessman, following in his footsteps. Matter of fact, when we had our first discussion that I thought the Lord wanted me to preach, he suggested we build a little church down on the corner of Church and Arms Street, because he had a little lot there. So build a little church there, you can preach and be a businessman at the same time. I said, "Oh, Dad, I don't think that's what the Lord had in mind." But even though he was disappointed, my mother was gleeful that her son was going to be a preacher. My daddy was a little skeptical, a little slow to accept. But after he heard my first sermon, he said, "You may be right. You know, it wasn't a good sermon, but for your first sermon, it looks like the Lord may have beckoned you. You know, He may have beckoned you." So he became,
talk
thank
about
God,
faint praise.
Well, he came to Mobile, where I was pastoring in 1954, 55. He came down there. I had been there about 3 years, and he came to church. He never got to the other church I pastored, but he came to Mobile, which was my third church, and sat in the congregation and talked with some of the men after church, who told him how much they respected my ministry. And all that was the happiest moment of his life. And I had tried to tell him, that it was in the family. His grandfather was a preacher, but that didn't impress him. That didn't make any difference with him. But after that, he was completely at ease.
I would also think, judging from just a little bit of what you said about what kind of kid you were, that both of your parents were a little surprised that you ended up going.
I was hoping you wouldn't get that. As a matter of fact, when I preached my trial sermon in Huntsville at Lakeside Church that night, the preacher announced it. You couldn't get near the church. I have to confess, for blocks. I haven't drawn such a big crowd since. Ebony has rated me one of the great preachers, but I've never drawn such a crowd as that night. You couldn't get near the church. And it was really, it's the roughest sermon of my life, because all the kids I had, played around with and messed around with, and the girls I had teased and etc., were there, with their cynical expressions and so forth. And it was a tough time, but it was joyful. I felt a deep sense of calling, and I got through it. And everybody came up and patted me on the back and told me that maybe this is what the Lord wants you to do. And especially my father. That was most gratifying to me, because I was really concerned about how he would react. Well, I met another preacher in high school who also planted. He was Sam Williams, who later we pastored together here, served together here in Atlanta. He was at He served at Friendship Church. Just before I got there, he passed away. I pastored Central, which was across the street. But at that, he was a man who was down to earth and not so pontifical. And I got a different image of a preacher ministry. And then when I went to college in Knoxville, met Reverend Evans, a Presbyterian preacher, who really inspired me. And he had me doing some work for him around the church as to earn a little money and rake leaves. And he had me clean up the church and stacking hymnals. I like stacking hymnals better than raking leaves. So I worked with him, and I got used to being around the church. It wasn't so bad. And the Reverend Fields' admonition kept coming back to me. And then I told my mother about it long before I told my daddy. And she was delighted and not surprised. She said, "Well, your grandfather on your father's side was a preacher. I have 2 brothers-in-law who are preachers. I had 2 of her sisters married preachers. And you grew up in the church. Well, I said, yeah, that's why I knew I wasn't going to be a preacher. I had to go, and I decided when I got so I could make the decision I wouldn't be going. But it didn't turn out that way. And I think the Lord really intended for me to preach. And I did the best I could.